Hey, very good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many of you today at the first seminar of this new work on the Roman Republic series, which will be carrying on until well, just before Easter. And it's a great pleasure to be able to kick off this new series with a talk by Hannah Cornwell from the University of Birmingham. Hannah's work is at the intersection between Roman imperialism and civic discord. She has published in 2017 a very influential and highly original monograph, Pax and the Politics of Peace, Republic to Principate, with Oxford University Press. And she has been working more broadly, on the one hand, on Roman diplomacy and its political and cultural implications and rules of engagement. And on the other hand, and especially in recent years, on conflict in the Roman world, engaging with a wide range of issues, also with a comparative approach that has brought her in close and very fruitful conversation with historians from who work mostly on later periods, including the contemporary world. Her paper today takes us, I suppose, right to the core of these interests that she has been pursuing of late, and indeed she takes us back to the interplay between the study of conflict and the study of wider cultural and intellectual dynamics. Internal war and the deconstruction, D between brackets, of identity in the late Republic. Hannah, thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Federico and Mattia, for your kind words and invitation. I'm glad your introduction's been recorded, Federico, so I can borrow it for my university webpage, because that was a lovely introduction that makes me sound quite impressive. As Federico outlined already, what I'd like to talk about today is as part of some work I've been doing on thinking about internal war in particular. I'm part of a research network that's looking at this concept in antiquity from the Archaic period to late antiquity. And so I'm presenting to you some current thoughts, which I need to work up into a chapter for an edited volume later this year. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have the collective expertise in this virtual room. So I look forward to your comments and suggestions. But more than anything else, the building of a temple of Concordia by Opimius distressed the people, for he seemed to be exalting himself and being high-minded, and in a way, to be triumphing over so many slaughtered citizens. Therefore, during the night, certain persons wrote the following verse under the inscription of the temple: the work of discord, aponoia, made this temple of concord, homonoia. Plutarch's late 1st century CE narrative is the only account of this act of public vandalism as a reaction to the senatorial monopoly of a message of internal harmony. The alleged sedition of Gracchus and his followers came about in the wake of senatorial opposition to a number of political and social policies, which Gracchus has succeeded to pass through the voting assembly as tribune. After an altercation on the Capitoline Hill, most likely in relation to the senatorial attempt to annul Gracchus's laws and the death of an alleged attendant of Opimius, the consul took armed control of the capital, stationing himself in the temple of Castor and Pollux in the Roman Forum, whilst Gracchus and Fulvius set up a base of armed resistance on the Aventine Hill, a site which constituted, at least in literary accounts, the seat of popular secession. Despite their attempts to broker reconciliation through Fulvius's younger son in the theatrical guise of a messenger, The consul Opimius demanded their surrender. The upshot was the deaths of not only these popular leaders, but some 3,000 Roman citizens, all killed without due trial. This, in fact, contravened legislation that Gaius Gracchus had himself put in place 2 years earlier to ensure that no Roman citizen, no civis, could be executed without order of the populace Romanus. But how could the consul Opimius have even legitimately claimed to have re-established concord with the blood of Roman citizens on his hands? Prior to the Gracchus withdrawal to the Aventine, the Senate, fearful for the state of disturbance that had gripped the city, had ordered Opimius to save the res publica by whatever means necessary and to destroy the tyrants, passing for the first time a decree which, whilst of legal ambiguity, would appear to have in some way permitted the consul to overrule or overlook pre-existing laws such as Gracchus's own Lex Sempronia de Capite Civis Romani. A purification ritual to absolve the bloodshed followed, which effectively erased any trace of political insurrection, although Opimius would be tried and acquitted of the deaths of Roman citizens the following year. And the Senate celebrated the restoration of order in the form of a temple of concord situated in the Roman Forum in close proximity to the Senate House, the Comitium, and the Speaker's platform. The political graffito on the Temple of Concord evidently aimed to highlight the sheer absurdity of an act of senselessness in Plutarch's Greek, apanoia, the loss of perspective or madness, which could be celebrated as an act of harmony or one-mindedness, homonoia, of the citizen body. Quite whether the Latin term, if we are to believe Plutarch's construction of events, quite whether the Latin term of opposition was their cordia, a want of reason, as Acer has suggested, or a play on discordia, concordia, it is worth noting that the popularity in elite Latin narratives of the discordia instigated by the Gracchi, see here Varro and Pliny on Gaius Gracchus's reforms, and to plausibly understand an Opimian narrative of this Gracchian discord resolved through his act of concordia being effectively flipped on its head in the graffito. As a form of political communication, the subversive graffito on the newly dedicated temple opened up political debate and disputes in late Republican politics on the nature of social cohesion and nominally commonly held values such as concordia, a term which came, so Varro tells us, from cor congruens, a congruent heart or mind. Indeed, it's worth highlighting here that the several reiterations of the Ides Concordiae as a cult designated to ensure the continued social order and harmony embodied in the concept could and indeed did serve as a theatre for disputes, disruption, and social disintegration. The historiography of the various dedications to Concordia in close proximity to the seat of senatorial power, which reinforced the monopoly of political elites over the concept, always followed a point of civil unrest and disunity between different bodies within the state, notably the populace and the Senate. Livy's account of Gnaeus Flavius's dedication to Concordia in 304 is given as a clear moment of division of the Roman civitas, and the vow to Concordia in this year was a promise for the restoration and reconciliation between the ordines, if we follow Pliny the Elder's account in his Natural Histories, and that's book 33, chapter 19. These moments of dedications to Concordia emphasize, as Joseph Helgerush has articulated, the negative implications of Concordia, designating the absence or the end of dispute between parties or individuals who had clashed or who could quarrel. The episode of 121 BCE, if we are to accept or believe Plutarch's account, encapsulates several elements that I'd like to explore a little further this afternoon, specifically in relation to how political discourse concerning internal conflict and war was shaped and framed during periods of such unrest, specifically in relation to ideas of collective identity within a community. How central was a sense of collective identity to a community's health and stability, and how was it affected by and manipulated during internal tensions, conflicts, and disintegrations? Henningbaum has argued in the introduction to civil wars in ancient Greece and Rome that precisely because the enemy in these conflicts, and here he's referring to internal stases and wars of a single citizen community, were not the others, it was necessary to give specific justification for violence against them. Starting from a conceptual point of a civitas possessing a shared identity as being bound as a community through being citizens, a civic enemy cannot indeed be the other. As David Armitage has argued in attempting to define civil war, he looks for two particular characteristics for a war to be civil war. Firstly, that the war is within the boundaries of a single political community, and that it involves at least two contending parties, one with a legitimate claim to authority over the community. Although, as Carsten Lange has clearly articulated in his review of Armitage's book, that the concept of civil war is a slippery one, and that there was and is never ever only one narrative, which of course is very relevant to the material we're going to look at. And indeed, as the episode of 121 BC illustrates, the framing of citizens as dangerous to the unity of the community necessitates putting them in opposition and a position of otherness. A need, as Baum articulates, to legitimize violence against members of your own community, a disruption and disintegration then of a shared or collective identity. I want to approach the notion of the other differently and from a position of mediation, which is to say diplomacy. Now, while tradition modern state diplomacy has been viewed first and foremost as a mechanism for regulating external interactions and relations, as something between distinct communities and not internal concerns of a single political entity, we can, I think, see internal war as a state where the hostile external nature of opponents is stressed, at least rhetorically, if not legally. And so I'd like to borrow some thoughts from Kostas Konstantinou in his work on the way to diplomacy, where he states, diplomacy is the enacted regulation of relations between self and others. It is impossible to communicate with what is already one with an undivided unity. There is neither a need, reason, nor a need to mediate what is same. He goes on to say, diplomacy's raison d'etre is therefore established only when there are boundaries for identity and when those boundaries of identity are crossed. In the turbulent internal conflicts of the Roman Republic, the state was not an undivided unity, and the mediation of self and other through both hostile politics, to borrow a phrase from Alison Rosenblit, and rhetorics of negotiation and reconciliation provide suitable grounds for a framework of diplomacy as a political tool. And it's Konstantinou's concept of boundaries for identity and the crossing of these boundaries that I wish to consider further as a means of examining collective identity and narratives on the nature of a political and civic entity during what we might frame as internal war. However, first to think a little bit more about the construction of a collective civic identity. When viewed through the Ciceronian corpus, the res publica of the Roman state may be conceptualized as the practice of politics through consensus, or at least communality and a sense of agreement. So as he states here in De Legibus, if the Senate is recognized as the leader, the dominus of public policy, and all the other ordines defend its decisions, its decrees, and are willing to allow the highest order to helm the state by its council, then this compromise by which supreme power, potestas, is granted to the people and actual authority, auctoritas, to the Senate, will make possible the maintenance of that balanced and harmonious constitution. Concordia here appears, at least on the surface, to express ideas of social cohesion and shared values. For Cicero, Concordia was a means for constructing a sense of community and commonality within the res publica, in terms of different components of the state having a shared sense of responsibility and a form of social contract for the preservation of socio-political cohesion. That agreement, that concordia, is easiest in that commonwealth in which the same thing is expedient for all. In stark contrast to when individuals have different self-interests, which creates discord, as he goes on to say, out of the varieties of advantage where different things are expedient for different people, discordia is born. Sallust argues that concordia could create a civitas from disparate and scattered components. Yet also that political discourse of the late Republic was one characterized through discord. The loss of the metus hostilis perpetuated internal conflict through the lack of binding social cohesion which internal war brought about. Indeed, if concordia was a concept integral to describing and framing the res publica as a united political entity, its promotion, in fact, served to articulate moments of tensions and conflict through a reassertion of social and civic unity. We need only think of that dedication to Concordia and Opimius's claims of unity at the end of Civic Discord. As previously mentioned, the historiography of the various dedications to Concordia always followed a point of civil unrest and disunity. The monument is presented as a reassertion of civic stability, yet became, as Morstein Marx has succinctly articulated, a sharply contested site of contemporary reflection on the meaning of recent trauma. Indeed, the temple was not just a site for contest and debate on the meaning of ideals between the populace and the Senate, but also between the elites themselves. Cicero had famously summoned the Senate to a meeting in the Temple of Concordia on the 3rd of December, 63, to examine the alleged conspirators plotting to overthrow the res publica. The choice of location served to frame Cicero's actions as an invocation of concord in opposition to the behavior he attributed to his opponents. Of course, Cicero did not have a monopoly on the rhetoric of concord. In a debate on the 1st of January 43 BCE held in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus concerning whether to send embassies to Marcus Antonius, Cicero vehemently attacked Antonius's version of concord, reminding his audience how Antonius had corrupted the site of Concordia during meetings of the Senate that he had convened as consul in September 44 with an armed guard, literally holding the Senate prisoner to his whim. The temple was turned into a jail. The doors of Concord were closed. It is reasonable to assume that Antonius chose the temple as a location specifically to harness the potency of the site to invoke rather than disrupt harmony. This served no doubt as a response to Cicero's recollection in Philippics 1, 31 of Antonius's speech from the 17th of March 44 as the ultimate display of much needed concord. In January 43, Cicero subverted Antonius's message of stability through his use of the temple, yet at the same time was himself open to attack in the very same arena. In the days following Cicero's fifth Philippic, the senatorial debate moved to the Temple of Concordia, no doubt a conscious decision on the part of the consuls to frame the debate in terms of a quest for internal stability. If we follow the account given by Cassius Dio, Cicero's attack on Antonius on that day, which once again appears to have stressed Cicero's adherence to homonoia and Antony's dereliction of it, was rebuffed by Calanus. Dio's Calanus presents Antonius as the bringer of harmony, casting Cicero's planned trip to Athens in the summer of 43 as a rejection of the homonoia shared by everyone else, and framing his consulship of 63 in terms of stasis, internal strife, rather than peace and harmony. Did you not throw our city into confusion and discord when it was at peace and harmonious, and fill the forum and capital with slaves? While we must be conscious of anti-Ciceronian rhetoric lying behind this speech, it nevertheless indicates the disputed nature of concordia in late Republican debate as a term that was used for negotiating relations between political players and the res publica. Concordia was one of several concepts that gained particular prominence in the political conflicts of the late Republic, notably through the media of oratory and coinage, in debates on the stability and security of the res publica. And here is a list of the various qualities that appear on the coinage over the course of the late second to the end of the 1st century BCE. And the qualities that are in all caps or in capitals are because they appear as legends on the coinage, and those in lowercase are identified by attributes on the coinage. Elsewhere, I have argued in a 2020 chapter in an edited volume on coins of the Roman Revolution for the Republican origins of imperial ideals, framing these as a product of the political language of crisis during the civil conflicts and wars of the 40s and 30s, and that the expansion and diversification of how best to express concern for maintaining the health of the state should be understood as part of the political discourse between various political actors who are looking to promote their cause and their version of the state over those of their opponents. The numismatic field serves as a vehicle for competitive self-promotion and debate over ownership of various values by political rivals during the instability of Republican crises. The traditional values of the Roman state as ideals over which political individuals could challenge each other and communicate their own integrity to the well-being of the state was also echoed during the conflicts of 68 to 69 CE, with an ever-expanding repertoire, as you can see here, of possible combinations and formation of values being added. So, for example, we can have pax et libertas or salus et libertas, and then these formations of values such as fides exercitum or concordiae praetorianorum. Across the various issuing authorities, common themes of concordia, fides, libertas, pax, and salus are variously adapted to the situation and relationships that needed to be confirmed and solidified for each. The coinage of the civil wars of the late Republic and the year of the 4 emperors provides us with a vocabulary of political discourse, thereby enabling us to examine the value system of the Roman state as presented at times of internal crisis. The varied and overlapping voices around such key sets of concepts reflect a shared language, which Claudia Moetti describes as all actors at a moment in history can, in effect, talk the same language without being invested in it in the same way. And this she describes as l'autonomie, the aptitude for political imagination, for alterity, as well as alteration, for cleavages or splits in conception and practices. If forming a society is always constituting a unit, the nature of this unit varies according to times, as does its potential for segmentation. So with this in mind, I'd like us now to turn to think about the bellum sociali, the social war, as an internal form of conflict, which highlights key aspects of the disintegration and construction of shared identities. Some 18 years after the conclusion of the war between Rome and its Italian allies, which erupted in 91 BCE following several failed attempts at equal access to political, legal, and economic rights, this coin was minted, depicting on the reverse the personifications of Roma and Italia joining hands as a symbol of concordia, and indeed specifically fides. As a bond of obligation, fides was an essential concept for relations of dependency, especially relationships which were extrafamilial within a Roman framework. Fides was found between parties for whom a societas or an amicitia was instituted, as is suggested by Cicero's use of the quotation from Ennius, for there is no fellowship inviolate, no faith kept, when kingship is concerned, nulla sancta societas nec fides. It regulated relations between different interest groups within the political community, between patron and client, within marriage, but also bonds forged outside of the immediate citizen body, expressing reciprocity, yet also asymmetries of power, particularly noteworthy in the phrase deditio in fidem, or sorry, that should be in se fidem dare. Rome's expectation of the Italian communities who were bound by treaty, who were foederati, was an absolute adherence to Rome, with prohibitions on bonds of fides being formed between Italian communities themselves, which it would appear was tantamount to conspiring against the Roman state, as the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus of 186 illustrates. Let no one conspire, collude, plot, or make vows in common amongst themselves, or pledge loyalty to each other, nevi quisquam fidem inter se dedici. The coin of 70 BCE was most likely minted in recognition of the census of that year, which saw the assessment of the Italians and Latins enfranchised following the social war, an acknowledgement of the new shape of Rome's citizen body that ostensibly brought Italy and Rome into true unity, a reassurance perhaps of a collective identity confirmed by and extended through bonds of obligation, yet which still served to assert Roman imperium and military power. The bonds of fides, their ruptures and realignments, provide a framework for the ways in which internal relations might be and indeed were conceptualized. The conflict between Rome and its allies at the beginning of the 1st century BCE provides us with a case study that reveals the complexities of terminology and definition of conflicts as internal war. We're not dealing exclusively with a conflict between members of the same polity, that is between cives, but indeed it is the Italians' exclusion from the jus civitatis and the failure of the promised citizenship to materialize that is the focal point of many of the literary accounts of the conflict, and was a conflict that centered around fundamental questions of participation and membership of the Roman state as a political and legal entity. When seeking to define the limits of a collective identity, the various narratives of the social war suggest the fluidity of boundaries of definition of this conflict. For authors with greater distance from the events, the war was at base value a civil war, Appian referring to it as an emphulios polemos and Florus a civile bellum. The various fragments of Diodorus Siculus present the rupture in relations as a consequence of both the diastasis between Rome and the Italian communities, as well as the disagreement and stasis of the populus Romanus and the Senate, ultimately leading to war, though only characterizes the subsequent stases at Rome over the Mithridatic command as emphulioi. The epitome of Pompeius Trogus appears to frame the Italian war as distinct and yet ultimately less damaging to the Roman state than the domestic factions and civil war. While for Cicero, in a categorization of bella externa and bella domestica, the wars with Rome's allies, of which he mentions Fregellae and the Marsi, follow his praeteritio on the seditiones domesticae of the Republic rather than foreign wars. Nevertheless, as Jung has demonstrated, the ethnic persecution, notably of the Samnites during the Marian-Sullan civil war, was a means of veiling the domestic nature of the conflict, shifting the focus onto the Samnites as the other and the outsider from a civic collective. The social war is by no means the first instance of what we might frame as an internal conflict, which extends beyond the limits of the community of Roman citizens. As Dominic Mashtek has demonstrated, the revolt and subsequent sacking of the Latin colony of Fregellae in 126 BCE should be understood as symptomatic of the internalization of violence, observable from the Gracchan period onwards and the beginnings of civil war. What the social war does offer us is an episode that is variously framed by literary and non-literary evidence in terms of boundaries for identity, notably with something of the Italian voices also being discernible and offering potentially different narratives. The narratives of conflict were, at least in part, centered around the question of inclusion and exclusion into the Roman state as cives, and the long-standing nature of relations and bonds of alliance and fides, with Florus going so far as to compare the Italian revolt to citizens rebelling intra urbem and stressing the concept of unity existing, at least from his 2nd century CE perspective, between Rome and the Italian communities. Traces one blood from all of these. It has formed a body from its parts and is one from all. Virtual family bonds, which Florus reiterates through the image of Rome as mother and parent city, against which the Italians rose. And Federico Rosso has noted that this presentation frames kinship as a 2nd-degree bond born through Roman concessions, whereas he argues for Velleius, the concept of consanguineity was, and I quote, the principal ideological ground on which the Italians based their claim to Roman citizenship. And so we can observe an Italian rhetoric centered around commonality of gens et sanguis, despite the Roman state viewing them as foreigners and aliens. Indeed, the concept of consanguinity and brotherhood was also used to describe the Aeduans following an alliance dating back to at least the mid-2nd century CE. And there, the references at the bottom of the slide there. The proximity of identities and recognition of Italy's long-standing contributions to Rome's imperium can also be framed in terms of the expectations of fides. Florus characterizes the allies as fidelissimi, who were led against Rome due to Rome's own inability to rule itself, despite its arbitration over kings and other peoples. Velleius emphasizes the theme of fides in his account of his own Italian ancestors, or his grandfathers, extreme loyalty to Rome during the conflict. So we see here the perpetuation of fides instead of its rupture that is evident elsewhere. From an Italian perspective, which can be approached through the coinage and the sling bullets, and to some extent the literary sources, such as Diodorus Siculus' fragmentary account and indeed Velleius's, the narrative focuses on the establishment of new bonds of fides, of a collective community, what Diodorus describes as koine polis, under the name of Italia, to the exclusion of Rome, a transgression of pre-existing Roman ideas about the relationship between itself and its various allied communities. The presentation of Italia was effectively the presentation of an artificial subject, and to borrow Kostas Konstantini's language once again, comprising a number of discrete, differentiated subjectivities, notably through diverse language and leadership, and the different responses of Italian communities to the subsequent grants of citizenship made in 90 BCE onwards, ostensibly bound together through what we might see as mimicry of Roman structures and iconography to shape a new Italian identity. The assertion of this Italianness as a global phenomenon was a response to perceived disruption to their participation of and failure to be fully included into a Roman state, which extended far beyond the limits of the urbs and civitas. The construction of Italia as an alternative political identity to Rome served, at least in terms of rhetoric disseminated during the war, as its promotion via the coinage and sling bullets suggest, to define their own collective political identity in opposition to Rome, who was framed as the other, as the famous coin depicting the bull and the wolf on the reverse illustrates, Rome as the other who was to be conquered, regardless of whether the creation of an actual legitimate separate political entity was the reason for the Italians' revolt from Rome in the first place. However, the boundaries for identity between self and other within a single political community become increasingly complex to navigate and open to interpretation. Processes for othering actual members of the res publica and justifying violence against them as necessary for the safety of the state became demonstrable from at least the end of the 2nd century BCE with the introduction of various mechanisms for crisis management. Notably the so-called Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which identified a threat to the safety of the res publica from a senatorial perspective, ostensibly providing some form of legitimacy to violent action via the enactment of consular potestas, and the hostis declaration formula introduced by Sulla in 88, effectively beginning or plausibly continuing a process already begun by the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, albeit in a different tone and framework, that both formalized and normalized the use of language of external war within domestic politics. The normalization of such language can be seen, for example, in Cicero's rhetoric against political opponents, such as the so-called Catilinarian conspirators. So here we have an extract from his 4th speech. "These men I accept and I willingly set apart from the rest, for I do not think that they should be classed in the number of worthless citizens, but in that of the most bitter enemies, hostes." Or indeed of Marcus Antonius, here in the 4th Philippic, where Cicero contrasts Antonius to a traditional form of hostis that the Roman state would be more familiar with, one that has its own constitution. Both these internal opponents had not yet even been actually declared public enemies of the res publica. But through these characterizations, Cicero provides clear distinctions between himself and his audience, who share a collective interest in the state, and the Roman other, who is both the root of domestic and civic strife, but is also an external enemy, and so characterized whether rhetorically or legally as separate from the citizen body. Yet even through a framework of interstate conflict, even though it was being applied to interpersonal political relations at Rome, it was also being contested as part of the competitive language of Republican politics. The status applied either to individuals or to the situation and circumstances was debated and fluid. Those declared hostes could turn the tables on their opponents with similar declarations, as this table illustrates. And the conflict could be debated as being a tumultus or a bellum, depending on the orientation and alliances of those characterizing it as such, as was the case during the debates concerning the Senate's relations and reaction to Marcus Antonius in early 43. Disputes and disparity in the presentation of events highlight the disruption to social and political unity and the collapse of any potential social cohesion. Cicero's own claims to have removed a civil and domestic evil from the res publica and to have re-established Societas, Concordia, and Salus Communis during his consulship was challenged some 20 years later during the debates over Marcus Antonius's position at the beginning of 43. And we've already seen that speech that Dio Cassius puts in the mouth of Calanus, charging Cicero with the destruction of peace and civic harmony. Such debates about who was truly aligned with the well-being of the state in times of crisis are also evident through the coinage as a communicative and competitive medium. And in remains, I would like to very briefly consider Republican and imperial contests of ownership surrounding a key ideal inherent to the shape of the res publica, and that is libertas, and how it served as a means of positioning oneself positively in relation to the state and indirectly othering one's opponents. Early imperial engagement with libertas affords us insight into the role of collective social memory in political discourse at moments of internal crisis and disintegration. Tacitus presents Nero's demise with the phrase usurpator statim libertate for the senatorial elite, having earlier begun his narrative with the assertion of libertas as the preserve of writers during the res populi Romani as a historical entity, and with the post-Actian period characterized in terms of servitude for the sake of self-interest and the false illusion or appearance of freedom. The assassination of Gaius Caligula was similarly framed as the restoration of republican libertas, perhaps most strikingly in Josephus's account of the consul Sentius Saturninus's speech, which recalled the unsuccessful attempt to restore liberty by tyrannicide in 44 BCE and contrasting it to the achievement in January 42 CE, culminating in the praetorians receiving the watchword of freedom from the consuls. No less striking is Claudius's own assertion of libertas following his accession, but as libertas Augusta, shifting the value away from the republic and situating it as an imperial benefaction. Libertas as tyrannicide exemplified in the famous Ides of March coin from 43 to 42 BCE validated certain violent actions on behalf of the res publica, framing the unspoken other as justifiably removed for the protection of that ideal. Indeed, the value of this republican argument for violence justified in the name of libertas was acknowledged explicitly on a coin minted in Spain in April to June 68, depicting libertas populi Romani restitutat on the obverse and a replica of the Brutus Ides of March coin on the reverse. Such a pointed reference back to an explicit presentation of libertas offers an implicit framework and tradition of libertas as tyrannicide, and leaving open and yet implied the question of who the tyrannical other in 68 CE was. Despite its specific replication and recollection of the Ides of March coin, the Spanish coinage was not the single proponent of the central value of libertas to internal conflict discourse in the 1st century CE. Claudius Macer, Praetorian legate in North Africa under Nero in 68 CE, established a new locally levied legion under his own name. The First Macriniana Libertatrix Legion, and also rebranded the Third Augusta Legion with the additional name Libertatrix. These actions are commemorated on his coinage, which must have served to pay his troops and endorse their new function in revolt from Nero, emphasizing not only their designation as Libertatrix legions, but also the personification of the Peleus-bearing Libertas, as well as the placement of SC, Senatus Consulto, on all his silver coinage. By this legend, he appears to have claimed senatorial backing by decree, no less, as a means to validate his actions and to align his activity with a form of corporate identity and authority of the Roman state. In reality, the situation did not matter. The power of the SC was a further way to signal, along with his rhetoric of libertas, the justification for his actions and silently aligning his unspoken opponent as the other in relation to the state. Political conflict and internal wars in the late Republic and early imperial period can be conceptualized in terms of the fluidity and application of commonly held ideals concerning the well-being of the state. This debate and dispute over the nature and ownership of specific values and ideals, together with the language of othering civil opponents, was in part instrumental in the collapse of the Republic. The complex and disputed narratives on ideals were an integral aspect for constructing and challenging of social order and the stability within Roman political thought. When seeking to define the limits of a collective identity, we may discern a fluidity of boundaries in moments of internal debate, conflict, and disruption. What we may equally discern through an examination of the use of language and iconography is how such concepts of unity, stability, and well-being were explicitly deployed to promote one identity in relation to the state or community at the expense of any internal opposition. A knowledge and understanding of expectations of social contracts and models of idealized behavior in relation to the res publica were used to illustrate the legitimacy of one individual's or one group's actions against another within the political community, serving to define the boundaries for identity between the self and other. Thank you very much for listening, and I welcome any questions and feedback.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for this wonderfully wide-ranging and stimulating paper. There's so much to talk about. Oh, and yes.
Yes,
and loads of references to write down.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, I'm opening the floor for questions and comments. As ever, just raise your hand, and well, perhaps while people are collecting their thoughts, I have a question on a well, I suppose peripheral point, no pun intended. If we go back to, well, there's no need to do that on the slide, but if we go back to the coin, the 7069 BC coin, the handshake between Rome and Italy, I've often been wondering, and I don't have a view on this. Do you think that there is an implied hierarchy between those two figures? And if so, which one? Because many people have argued that there is a hierarchy and that Rome is in a dominant position.
I mean, they're occupying different positions in a sense, aren't they? I mean, Rome is presented as the military leader, and she does have her foot on the globe. So I mean, that does suggest, you know, dominance on several levels. Whereas Italia is, I mean, various interpretations I've read, obviously she's holding a cornucopia, so therefore she is symbolic of the abundance of Italy, with, you know, the winged caduceus behind her. But the stance of Rome certainly does, or as you say, is often interpreted as being the dominant one. And maybe there's, you know, the handshaking becomes, and just the two hands as a symbol on the coins in their own right later on, so in sort of the 40s and the 30s, is used a lot, you know, to signify internal agreement and concord and fides between Romans. But there it is, just purely a symbol of two hands. You don't see it attached to bodies. So the handshake perhaps is therefore intended to be something that is, if not equaling, you know, sort of of equality. And yet, yeah, I like you. I'm sort of uncertain here, and perhaps there's a potential for ambiguity in the message and being read anyway. That, you know, it can read as, you know, joining of these two peoples and states into a new unity as a positive thing, and yet, you know, for those who want to read it and can read it, this underlying message of Rome as Roman Imperium as key. And then obviously with the obverse, with honors et virtus, I mean, the Roman temple outside the Capaean Gate, I think, is a sort of strongly associated with military return. So yeah, I think with lots of the coinage, it's and the imagery on the coinage there, we run the risk of wanting to read lots into it without having, you know, a full understanding of what the intentions of the moniers are. But sorry, that was a very
Thank you very much. No.
answer. I don't know if anyone else has any exciting new ideas about the coin. I'm sure both myself and Federica would like to hear them. But,
yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Hannah. Federica in the chat, does any interpretation suggest that Rome is reaching out to claim Italia's cornucopia? I like that.
Oh yes,
predatory reading. Yes.
I mean, I have shown this coin to obviously I've used it a lot in teaching, and yes, this maybe particularly as this is quite worn. Yes, is this a sort of grab, a grab by Rome, and that's quite fun. I like that.
Actually, that the cornucopia is being handed over.
Exactly. Yes. And I suppose it is also, I mean, the cornucopia is also an attribute. I don't know when it first appears iconographically, but perhaps around this time. That would be nice and people for the Genius Populi Romani, as a young man holding a cornucopia. But I don't know how many images there are of that before the end of the Republic or the Imperial period. But it's certainly something that Rome will go on to claim as, you know, being an attribute of the state. So maybe, yes, maybe this is the moment that Rome takes it from Italy.
Thank you very much. Other more interesting big picture questions or comments?
I mean, I don't know about everyone else, but this is the first week of teaching at my university. So it's been quite a long week. Oh, Lindsay, thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, for your fascinating talk. And I'm beaming in. It's morning here in Canada, so it's nice to be here with all of you digitally in the UK. I was wondering if you might be able to speak a bit about how successful these attempts were to claim these particular values, or maybe sort of how we might measure that. And perhaps we don't have enough evidence to do that, but I'm just curious because it looks like, I especially liked your table with everyone saying, well, I'm the representative of Concordia. No, I'm the representative of Concordia. So I guess what I'm wondering is, can we go further than everyone sort of laying claim to these values, but are there examples where, for instance, sort of like the Opimius Graffito, we could say, oh, well, that was a bid, but it failed. You know, it didn't garner enough support.
Oh, that's interesting. In terms of evidence for failed bids, nothing has necessarily jumped to my mind, but I mean, there are particular virtues that get, I suppose, contested in quite rapid succession. So Pietas, for example, in the 40s is one that everyone is understandably wanting to sort of claim ownership of, with Sextus Pompeius tapping into the idea of filial duty and promoting his father in the coinage. potentially with young Caesar sort of borrowing or copying Sextus's image of Pietas on his coinage, although it hasn't got a label. And then Marcus Antonius using Pietas and almost sort of rebranding it with different attributes, or the attributes of Fortuna and the Rudder estate, but also promoting his brother as consul. And so this is around the time of the Perugian War. So there's, again, that's not sort of showing that one person failed or one person succeeded in the promotion, but that this was something they were, at least at this point in time, all wanting to use to illustrate, I suppose, particularly with Antonius's coin, which has himself on the obverse, and the reverse is a depiction of Pietas, but with a rudder and stalks, which is attributes of Fortuna, not Pietas, and the legend Pietas consul, which seems to be referring to his brother. And there's a passage in Dio Cassius which actually claims that Lucius Antonius took the cognomen Pietas, which seems a bit strange, but this display of, and there's been, Anton Powell's work on Virgil the Partisan has a chapter on the theft of Pietas. So again, lots of evidence of these things being sort of debated and a sort of competitive ownership. I could take the easy way out and say it's only with the end of the civil wars that someone is able to succeed ultimately in terms of the transformation of these republican ideals into imperial ideals, where they become, obviously Carlos Norena has done a lot on the imperial ideals, particularly in the coinage, in terms of creating a not a canon, but these virtues, as with I didn't show you the coin of Claudius, but it is interesting following at least the evidence for debates around Republican Libertas following the assassination of Gaius, that then Claudius starts to produce coins when he comes to power, depicting Libertas, but that it is Augustan Libertas, so it becomes imperial. So that's not really about the instances of actual failure, and I suppose it could be debated. Is Opimius's dedication to Concordia a failure? It's certainly challenged, although he doesn't lose his position, and the dedication of the temple isn't sort of ultimately stands. But I think that there's a very interesting point which I'm going to have. If you have any suggestions, Lindsay, with your your deep knowledge of Roman Republican religion, but I like the idea of trying to identify period episodes where an attempt is made and the failure is quite clear. But I will go.
Thank you very much. No, I don't have any ideas springing to mind, but thank you. Your answer has added a lot. Thank you, Hannah.
I see that Amy has helpfully put a comment about representations of the Genius Populi Romani from the Republic. Thank you. Yes. His cornucopia is an attribute of the Genius, not specifically the Populus Romanus. Thank you, Amy. Christina,
shall I read out your question? Or would you like to ask it? I'm just going to read it out. Very suggestive about Lucas Antonius. Yes. Could the statues that were dedicated to him by several groups mentioned by Cicero shed some light on that political and ideological struggle?
Yes. Christina, thank you. I should go away and look into that in more detail. That's fantastic. Thank you for, I think that's definitely worth me having a look into that, because I hadn't thought about that. So thank you. This is what I came for. Everyone giving me their good ideas.
More questions, comments? Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I have a question. It might be a bit tangential to what you were talking about, but right at the beginning, you were talking about mediation. And what I was wondering is whether some of the political actors would view mediation as possibly a slightly hostile act, thinking about that they might be individuals who are either fence-sitting or hedging, that they have contacts on both sides, which would make them suitable for carrying out mediation.
Yeah.
And we might think of them in the abstract as being neutral, but maybe at the time they would be, that sort of activity would be viewed in a different way.
A really interesting question. And I'm thinking of instances from the late civil wars in the 40s, and figures like Atticus, who seemed to, you know, if we take Knipos's biography, to successfully negotiate a position of not neutrality, being friends with both sides. And I suppose even Cicero in his letters talks about being an amicus of both Caesar and Pompey, and trying to use that friendship to somehow negotiate, but evidently from the various correspondence and letters he's receiving from supporters from both sides, it's not necessarily going down very well. So maybe that's an instance, you say, of sort of attempting mediation, but it actually not being viewed in a positive light, because you're not supporting those friendships and bonds of fides which you've previously established, but because you've got these bonds to both opposing groups, you'll find yourself stuck in the middle and trying to tread this line of mediation, and yet it actually, I suppose, politically for the individual, not necessarily being successful or a safe position.
I'm just thinking maybe the chronology of the conflict could play a part. So if you get to the stage where you've reached the tipping point, then any attempt at mediation or reaching out to the other side might look like a defection.
Yeah.
But possibly at the beginning, where things are more in the balance, it could be taken more in good faith. I'm just wondering.
No, thank you. I will need to give that some more thought, but yes, I think you're right that I need to give some more thought, or at least be more explicit about, as you say, when within the conflict this negotiation, or as you say, mediation is happening, because you're right, it will have an impact on the success or how that's perceived, depending on what the relations are at that time, as you know, before, at the beginning, during, and after, in terms of the progression and deterioration of relationships. Thank you.
Any more questions? I have one on qualities. Oh yes, Christoph, please, over to you.
I think
you're mute. Still can't hear you, Chris.
Should be better now.
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So I'm sorry. I thought the coin probably erased all questions I had in my head during your talk. So if I may go back to the coin and don't ask the big picture question Federico was hoping for, I'm just curious how the debate is focused, that the two ideas are on an equal balance. I mean, if one could so easily say that, I mean, you mentioned this idea with the foot on the globe. I'm not quite sure whether that's an early idea of the globe. But if that is true, it is a strong point of Rome being not on an equal level, and Italy is bringing all the goods and food and supplying Rome. So that would be a second point. But third point, and that's the one I'd like to hear your thoughts on, isn't the whole notion of Italy not in itself a Roman notion? So if we apply your concept of self and other, and you have this the whole idea of large territory with different people in it, and then you say, okay, we are Rome and you are Italy, it's in itself an asymmetrical discourse, isn't it?
Thank you. I think that's an excellent point, and particularly when this coin is being minted, I think you're right that we need to see this as a Roman presentation of Italy, or a Roman construction of Italy, rather than what is happening during the Civil War with the Italian coinage, which is a presentation of an Italian concept of Italia or Vitelliu. So yes, thank you. I think that's a very important point to actually stress with this later coin, that this is not Italian identity in terms of the Italian communities, but a Roman construction. Thank you, yeah.
It's not the Italy of 91.
No, yes.
It's an Italy of 70, yes. Yeah. Or of 88, 87, yeah. The question I was about to ask was on qualities and references to qualities, to divine qualities, to use Anna Clark's term, on coinage. There is that very impressive slide with a whole list of qualities on the coinage from 68, 69 BC, and you spoke of a never expanding.
I'm not sure I've got all of them either. So.
Well, okay. Well, my question really is whether you've spotted the disappearance of any divine quality that is, that is the features of Republican coinage, but it's for whatever reason not used in 68, 69.
That's an excellent question, Federico. Which I have
no idea.
I hadn't thought to look at, as you say, the disappearance, but I think that's a very good thing to think about. I want to say I don't think so, but well, pietas isn't in my list, is it? So that could be one that's disappeared. So yes, at least according to my list, we've lost pietas, but for that, obviously for that year and a bit, it doesn't disappear obviously entirely as far as I'm aware. But thank you. Yes, something else I need to go away and look at. Yes, the both the emergence and then the disappearance potentially, or the reduction in use of certain ideals, I think is a nice thing to look at and pursue as well. Amanda Claridge says,
thank you. 2 comments in the chat. Amanda Claridge.
Maybe that's it. Yes, they're there. Very patronizing of Rome, yes.
Yes, a sort of consolation prize.
Yeah, possibly very likely. And again, going back to Christoph's point that it's not the Italy of 91. It's the Roman rebranding of Italy and everything that involves. And I think Lindsay also has a comment in the chat. Would you like me to read it out, Federico, or would you like to read it out? Or would you?
Please go ahead.
Or Lindsay, would you like to read out your comment?
Oh, well, I didn't want to interrupt the discussion, but it just occurred to me, building on Federico's question, actually, that maybe that would be one way of trying to measure. And of course, as I said in my comment, there would be lots of other reasons why a particular value wouldn't be used as much. But nonetheless, maybe if we could start to see, oh, well, there's only a couple attempts to use Fortuna, and then suddenly Genius really increases. You could see people, maybe that's an example of a hashtag that didn't catch on, as it were.
I'm going to borrow that phrase, Lindsay. Thank you. Yeah, I will go away and spend more time looking at the coins and the quantity of them, particularly.
Any more questions, thoughts?
I don't know if there is a way to save the chat, Federico, so I'm just going to copy it. So I've got people's comments saved.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, it should be possible to save it. Yes. He is hoping. Michele Bellomo, please.
Hi, thanks. And I have just a quick question on one of your first slides on the iterations of the Edes Concordia. And there is this episode of 219 BC that is called by Livy on the praetor Lucius Manius Bullus, so where the dedication of the temple is made for a military sedition that took place in Gaul 2 years before. And so I was wondering if there are other episodes that where the military element played the disturbing act and calls for a reaction by the central authority or a magistrate or so on. So just a curiosity. Thank you.
Good question. That I off the top of my head, I do not have an answer to, but I think it's another good point in terms of, yes, you're right. I've been perhaps mainly focused on, particularly in my discussion of the Ides Concordiae, on political internal disputes amongst the populace, but you're absolutely right that there are other ways of framing what Concordia internally, particularly in the earlier books of Livy, a narrative about military sedition. So yes, thank you for the comment. And Amy might have something to add to that.
Okay, thank you.
Amy.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the person to ask about that would be Dominic Machado.
Yes.
And just thinking about some things I've heard him say recently, trying to channel him. I think maybe one thing he might say is that actually some of these military disturbances pose an interesting different angle to what you've been saying, because rather than trying to other the kind of discordant elements in some of these areas, it's more about a kind of rhetoric of denial.
Okay.
Right, that it's not real.
Great.
You know, we're going to pretend it never happened, or that they're not very important, rather than that they are, you know, our enemies. And you know, he was specifically saying that that's done when these enemies are the sort of the people who would be constructed as the internal enemies are considered to be of low status, or kind of like not worthy of this kind of rhetoric. But yeah, that's that's me.
Thank you. No, that's great. I will get in
like
contact
a bad
with
idea.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. I like that rhetoric of denial. Great. Someone else to sort of contact.
I don't see more raised hands, but there was certainly.
There is Amy Russell, I think.
I think Amy just spoke, but I mean, she might have another one. Amy.
No, she leva proprio la seconda one.
It might be what we call a legacy hand.
She's now lowered it. It's a legacy hand.
No, that was just left over.
It was a legacy hand. Yes, I like that. Yes. Well, I got one more question, comment, which is followed by a question. The comment is that you have, I think, very judiciously left the struggle of the orders out of account. And well, I think it's a laudable choice in a number of respects, but I think to some extent it is part of your problem, I guess. And in that connection, talking about the, well, overlaps and interplays between internal and external conflict. Early on in your talk, I was reminded of a strange passage in Dionysius of Halicarnassus that no one, I think quite rightly, takes seriously from an historical point of view, but where he says that the Fetiales were involved with at least the first settlement between patricians and plebeians. And well, that seems part of a potentially perhaps rather more interesting, or at least instructive, reflection on the one hand state formation, and on the other hand, yes, the terms of civic conflict in Augustan Rome.
Yes.
I wonder whether that is something you've come across or had a chance to
no, I haven't, but I think yes, I think you're right that thinking about this in, at least in the context of Augustan Rome and the repurposing perhaps of the Fetiales and their functions is something interesting to think about, at least from a late Republican Augustan perspective on the past, and how they are then trying to maybe explain, as you say, issues of internal identity and dispute. Thank you. Again, something to add to my list to go away and have a look at. Though I do like the idea of the Fetiales, as obviously you know very well, Federico, being framed as those who are brought in to settle sort of, yes, disputes, the making of war, the making of peace, and therefore being used internally as an interesting concept indeed. Or indeed, if that's meant to be understood that at that point the plebeians aren't really internal. Yes.
Yes, and then I mean, of course, a number of contemporary historians, but sort of modern historians have read the Fetiales as sort of part of a bigger story of state formation in ancient Latium and so on. Yeah. Yes. Any more comments, thoughts? Well, it seems to me that really Hannah has presented us with a tremendously thought-provoking, really inspiring overview of a problem that really invites us to do away with the familiar and to some extent convenient boundaries. The way in which you've actually taken us well beyond what we typically think of Republican territory, showing all sorts of really crucial continuities with 68, 69. Seems to me a very important insight to be drawn from your talk, and by no means not the only one. So really, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Hannah.
Thank you, very good. And thank you for comments, everyone. I should go away and work.
Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be reconvening in 3 weeks' time, I believe, Mattia.
Yeah,
with the
25th February of February, 25th. Yeah.
Yes, with David
Valerio Gaia, who will talk about women and economy, women
Indeed.
lending money in the Roman Republic.
Indeed. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Anna, especially.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Have a good weekend.